on the order paper. To move Amendment L, I call the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr John McDonnell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg to move the amendment in my name and that of my honourable and right honourable colleagues. This year, Mr Speaker, I've been in the House for 20 years, just, well, the same as yourself. Never have we seen in all that time such a threadbare scrap of a document as this Queen's speech. But let's be grateful for small mercies. It's a pleasure to note what has not been mentioned in this vacuous notelet. Despite being promised in the Conservative manifesto, we've heard no plans for legislation to end the triple lock. We've heard nothing about legislation to end winter fuel payments, and we've heard no legislative plans for the so-called dementia tax. Nothing of the policy to take food from the mouths of infants and young primary school children, and even the flagship grammar schools policy seems to have been ditched from the Queen's speech. So I would like to thank the millions of voters who rejected the Conservatives because they've prevented the Tories from implementing their full cuts that they promised. Thank all those people who called a halt to the barrage of cuts that the Tories were intending to introduce. But regrettably, instead, the government has been reduced to a grubby backroom deal in an attempt to cling on to office. The result that we have a Queen's speech devoid of content, which offers no solutions to the pressing issues facing our country. The Queen's speech says, and I quote, "My ministers will strengthen the economy so it supports the creation of jobs." Well, the reality, Mr Speaker, is that we are witnessing, to quote the Governor of the Bank of England, the weakest UK business investment in half a century. The growth, certainly in one sec, the growth of insecure, low-paid, low-skilled jobs, and now 1 million nearly on zero-hours contracts. Good way to honourable General.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very grateful for the Shadow Chancellor to give way. I'm very surprised he talks about jobs, because every single Labour government in history has left government with higher unemployment when it came to power. We have lowered unemployment and got more people into work. How can he possibly suggest that it would be better to have Labour?
I would check his facts on that, but let me just say this. The announcement. Well, I suggest he would go back to other Labour governments which have increased employment in this country as a result of direct state investment. But can I just say to him, there's more. Well, the Attlee government in particular, and we go on to the Wilson. Anyway, the issue for many of us is the quality of those jobs, and the fact now that we have people in employment who literally cannot fend off poverty as a result of that unemployment. Two-thirds of our children who are living in poverty are living in families where people are in work. That's the quality of some of the jobs that has been brought about by this government. And the Queen's speech promises, I quote, to invest in the NHS, schools and other public services. Well, the reality couldn't be further from the truth, could it? Spending per pupil remains set to fall. Police officers, firefighters, border guards, all jobs that will be cut. And the NHS already at breaking point and has been promised no new money. Not our words, Mr Speaker, but those of the British Medical Association. Now, the Chancellor has in various interviews over the last fortnight bemoaned the fact that he was hidden away during the election campaign and that his record on the economy was not the central plank of the Conservatives' campaign. And I agree. I wish he had been more to the fore in the campaign and his record more widely exposed, because if it had been, Labour would be in government now. I don't believe so far that the honourable gentleman, the right honourable gentleman, has been afforded his proper place in history. For those honourable members who were not in this place 10 years ago, let me explain that the Chancellor prior to 2010 was the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And as an ardent neoliberal, the Chancellor in his role as the Chief Secretary was the architect of austerity. It was he who designed the detailed economic programme rolled out by his mentor, George Osborne, after 2010. And he's been at the heart of every austerity cabinet throughout this period. And in his recent Mansion House speech, he referred to his government's austerity record, and I quote, "a record of which we are proud." Well, the foundation of the Chancellor's record is his adherence to neoliberalism, trickle-down economics, a theory which argues if you cut the taxes for the rich and the corporations, and yes, turn a blind eye to tax avoidance and tax avoidance, somehow this wealth will trickle down to the rest of society. Well, this Chancellor has certainly cut taxes for the rich and for the corporations. Corporation tax, capital gains tax, inheritance tax and the bank levy have all been slashed by this Chancellor. Independent analysis demonstrates the OBR costing of tax cuts introduced by the Conservatives on these four measures, just these four measures alone since 2010, will have cost taxpayers over £70 billion between last year and the end of his Parliament, certainly. There was someone else here, I think, came up first, yes.
I thank him very much for giving way. As he well knows, increasing corporation tax actually leads to reduced tax revenues, as history tells us. So his plans, were he in government, would actually have led to a fall in the revenue from corporation tax. Can he tell us how, were he in the position to do so, he would make up that shortfall in revenue for government?
So the argument that was put forward was that corporation tax cuts were meant to lead to large-scale increase in business investment in our economy. Well, last year, business investment fell for the first time since 2009, and it remains lower than the rest of the G7, with the exception of Italy. So corporations are now sitting on over £580 billion worth of earned income they're not investing. And what we've seen is some have been exposed as using that earned income in share buyouts to boost performance statistics and therefore boost their bonuses. That's the level, that's the product of the corporation tax cuts. In due course. Let's just look at 7 years of austerity in addressing the grotesque and widening levels of wealth inequality in the UK. A report last year by Credit Suisse found that the richest 1% of people in the UK now own almost a quarter of the country's wealth. Certainly. The Sunday Times rich list told us that the richest 1,000 families in the UK had more than doubled their wealth since the financial crisis.
Would the honourable gentleman agree that because of Conservative policies, there are now some 4 million people in this country on the lower end of the wage scale who no longer pay any tax at all? This is the party that reduces taxes for the less well-off.
This is a party that has used the taxation system to cut corporation tax, capital gains tax, inheritance tax, the bank levy. It has been a redistribution from the poor to the wealthy. But this is the record, certainly.
Would you just clarify for the House what the standard rate of capital gains tax was under the last Labour government and what the standard rate of capital gains tax is now?
And this is a government that wants to cut corporation tax. Let me finish. From what it was at 28p, that went corporation tax. I thought the honourable gentleman was referring to on capital gains tax. On capital gains tax, remember who this is going to. This is going to the 60,000 wealthiest families in this country. That's what this cut is all about.
Would the honourable gentleman just tell the House what the rate was under the last Labour government and what the basic rate is now? When it comes to
when it comes...
Can I just say, I find it very hard to hear what the Shadow Chancellor's got to say. If I can't hear, you can't hear, so what's the point of posing a question if you can't wait for the answer? John McDonnell.
I'm sure the Chancellor will fill us into the details when he rises, but the reality is this. The reality is this. The reality is this. The reality is this, that when it comes to cutting taxes, what we've seen over the last 7 years is the treatment of the rich to tax cuts, whilst the poorest in our society has seen their services demolished in front of our eyes. And when it comes to the increase in levels of poverty in our society, it is a direct result of the redistribution of wealth from the poorest to the richest under this government. Well, let's measure. I'll give way in due course. Let's just measure, then, the impact of this record of tax cuts on the rest of society. Because it's important we do, because the Queen's speech promises just more of the same. This could have been the Queen's speech that ended austerity once and for all, and it certainly doesn't. So this is the record the Chancellor says he's proud of. Is it a matter of pride for the Chancellor that nearly 1.25 million food parcels were handed out in food banks over the last year? Are we proud of a government that cannot feed its population? How can anyone be proud that over 77 households were in temporary accommodation this year, almost an 8% increase on last year? How can anyone be proud? How can anyone be proud that there's been a 134% increase in people sleeping rough in this country? And there are now 1.2 million households on the waiting list. 70,000 in due course. 70,000 of our children are being brought up in temporary accommodation, whilst house building has fallen to its lowest level since the 1920s.
Friend, I wonder whether he's aware of the research by Professor Danny Dorling, which has stated that Britain is the second most unequal country on earth of the richest 25 nations. And unless well, it's not rubbish, it is a fact based on research by an eminent professor. And is he aware that if we continue on this trajectory, Britain is on course to be the most unequal nation on the planet within the next decade?
It is one of the warnings from the IFS that inequality will increase on a scale with the government's austerity programme continuing. So let me just say to the honourable members opposite, I will in due course. Can I just ask the question of the honourable members opposite then? Are they really proud that we have a government that can't adequately house its population? Certainly. Let me just finish this power and I'll come straight to you. Just on poverty itself, let's be clear. Can the Chancellor be proud that there are 4 million children that are trapped in poverty in this country? And it's not just children. The latest figures show that 14 million people are living in poverty in the UK. And that includes 2 million pensioners, the very people the Conservatives were going to hit with ending the triple lock, means testing winter fuel payments and introducing a dementia tax.
Mr. Speaker, Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman talks about things that we should be proud of. According to the Office for National Statistics just this week, the UK has the 5th lowest level of persistent poverty of anywhere in Europe. And compared to when the last Labour government was in power, when over 1 million young people had no jobs or education, we now have some of the lowest youth unemployment anywhere in Europe. Are these not statistics that we should be proud of?
Can I just say, I find it astounding that we can have that level of complacency when we have this levels of poverty, homelessness, and yes, people going without food, the choice between heating or eating every winter. Let me just finish this para. Over 80%, in due course, over 80% of the austerity measures have fallen on women. But some of the hardest hit on this record of pride from the Chancellor, some of the hardest hit have been disabled people. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, almost half of those in poverty are disabled or live in a household with a disabled person. The brutality of the work capability assessment has now been associated with 590 suicides.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. Does he share my dismay at the growing rate of child poverty in the UK? And has he seen the predictions by the Institute for Fiscal Studies that on the current trend, the rate will be well over 1/3 by the end of this Parliament, even higher than the catastrophic level inherited by the Labour government in 1997?
Shocking. We are returning to a society of grotesque inequalities and poverty among some of the most vulnerable within our society. How can anyone claim that as a proud record? How can anyone? Also, let me just finish this, then I'll come back. Certainly in one sec. Let's just turn to wages. Is it a record to be proud of that the Chancellor's cap on public sector pay has contributed to wages falling by 10% since 2008? We've witnessed the longest fall in wages on record. Nearly 6 million people earn less than the living wage. People were shocked when the RCN revealed nurses' pay had fallen by 14%, forcing some nurses to rely on food banks.
Honourable friend for giving way. In Ashfield, where I represent, average weekly earnings are below the national and the regional average. There have been previous attempts by this government to help create and protect jobs like the Regional Growth Fund. Not a penny of that money went to my constituency. Is it any wonder that so many in my constituency feel that they've been forgotten by this government?
We talk about people left behind. It's whole communities that have been left behind, right the way across the country. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
The right honourable gentleman giving way. He's making the case for spending more money, and indeed his party's manifesto included pledges to spend billions and billions of pounds more money, and that would be borrowed. What does he have to say to homeowners who would face higher interest rates as a result of his policies?
Yes, I was. In terms of investing for the long term to turn our economy around and grow the economy, I was following the advice of a whole range of economists, but I also took into account the advice that was provided to us too from quite a surprising source, really. It said, now is a good time to invest in generally productivity-enhancing infrastructure and to take advantage of low borrowing costs and our ability to borrow. That was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. But can I just say this? Is it something to be proud of that the UK is the only major developed country that's seen economic growth but falling wages? Yesterday, we had the absolute chaos of W-turns, S-bends, whatever they've described it, coming out from Number 10 and the Treasury over hints that the pay cap was to be scrapped. And it was a disgrace that last night the coalition of Tories and the DUP voted down our motion to support public sector workers simply securing a fair pay rise. I'm happy to give way to the Chancellor if he can now confirm whether the pay cap is lifted or not, and whether public sector workers will now get a fair pay rise as a result. Would he like to respond? I think we need the assurance as soon as possible. I tell you, Ministers are quick to praise the devotion and bravery of our emergency services in the aftermath of tragedies, and we've seen that in recent weeks. But last night, they could have extended their generosity to give those brave, conscientious men and women a decent pay rise that they so need to lift many of them out of poverty.
Will he give way on that point? He will be aware that both the IMF
and the OECD have said there's a relationship between inequality and growth, namely, the more inequality, the less growth. So wouldn't he agree that it's not just unfair, but unwise to pursue a policy which in Britain has led to the greatest inequality in Europe, rising at the fastest rate? And if we were fairer, we would be bigger, it would be a bigger cake and fairer shares for all.
Virtually every mainstream economist now and most mainstream economic institutions are arguing that a fairer society is one that is more economically efficient and one that is more sustainable in the long term. That is not what's being delivered by this supposed record of pride from the Chancellor. Well, let's... Sure.
Thank you, Shadow Chancellor, for giving way. Is he aware that 25% of posts in the National Minimum Wage Compliance Unit are lying vacant? And is that not one reason why national minimum wage compliance is so weak in this country?
The honourable gentleman currently chairs the PCS parliamentary group, which I chaired before. This has been something that we've campaigned on for 7 years. If you cannot staff up the unit that is meant to ensure inspections and compliance with the minimum wage, how can we expect the minimum wage, therefore, to be paid fairly? But let's look at the desperate state of our public services. How can anyone in government take pride in spending per pupil set to fall by 8% between 2016, 2019, 2020. Over 46,000 children's operations have been cancelled over the last 4 years. Police numbers cut by 20,000 since 2010. Firefighter posts been cut by 10,000 and 20,000 soldiers cut from the army since 2010. A record of pride? I don't think so. So we have a government that can't feed its people, can't house its people adequately, or protect our children and older people from poverty. It cannot ensure, I will shortly, it cannot ensure that when people go to work they earn enough to live on. It can't maintain our basic public services. That's a government that doesn't deserve to remain in office.
I thank the Shadow Chancellor for giving way, and will he agree with me that it's a scandal that those local authorities that have retained their council stock, and both sides agree we need more council housing now post-Grenfell, but those local authorities are now faced by, because of the bizarre and Byzantine rules for housing finance, they are faced by paying back money, even though they've built the houses because of those rules. Will you agree with me that's a scandal and we need to get rid of it as soon as we possibly can?
The housing situation in our country is in dire straits because of lack of building. That's why in the Popular Labour Party manifesto we promised to build 1 million new homes, half of those being council houses, and freeing up local government to perform the role that they traditionally have in putting roofs over their local people's heads itself. But all this suffering, in due course, all this suffering by ordinary people under austerity to protect the rich and the corporations has been for what? Has been for what? On the government's own metrics, it significantly failed. They promised that the deficit would be eradicated in 5 years. Now it will be 15 years at best. They have added $700 billion to the debt, leaving $1.7 trillion of debt for future generations. In the first quarter of this year, growth has fallen to 0.2%, and inflation now has increased to 2.9%. Last year saw the slowest rate of business investment since 2009. Unsecured debt per household will reach a record high this year, certainly.
I thank the Shadow Chancellor for giving way. During the election, Labour made over £105 billion worth of promises. If he were to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, when would he expect the deficit to be repaid?
2025. Well, what's interesting, because we were the only political party that published a costed programme. And I repeat it, the only numbers in the Tory manifesto were the page numbers, nothing more. And the honourable gentleman will send him a copy of the costing booklet. I thought he'd already received it, he clearly hasn't. And what we increased our expenditure is £48.6 billion and covered by a range of revenue sources. All of them identified, advised upon, and all of them were to ensure that day-to-day expenditure is covered. And actually it's the IFS It was the IFS, it was the IFS who told us that actually we would comply with Labour's fiscal credibility rule, reducing the overall deficit over a rolling 5-year programme and reducing the debt within that period. I'll come back to the honourable gentleman. It's not just the Labour Party that's highlighted the consequences of the Tories' failed economic approach. Last week, the Governor of the Bank of England warned of, I quote, weaker real income growth. He spoke about, I quote, markedly weak investment and rapid consumer credit growth. And worryingly, he warned the extent to which the UK's current account deficit has moved closer to sustainability remains open to question, as we continue to rely upon what he describes as the kindness of strangers to fund us.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. The Shadow Chancellor mentions comments by the Bank of England Governor, and the bank, like the Shadow Chancellor, are concerned about the rise in household debt, now at 142% of GDP, with unsecured borrowing rising by 10% just last year. Does the Shadow Chancellor share my concerns that household debt reflects the falling real wages we've seen under this government and spells problems for the future in terms of households being able to sustain the current levels of spending?
I'll come on to it, but household debt is now a record level. A record level. Why? Because wages are so low, and yet house costs and other costs, with inflation rising, are biting hard on working families. It's no wonder that they're having to resort to increased levels of debt just to get by. And these were the jams, the just about managing, that were supposed to be protected in the last budget. Sorry, no, Charlie, I've done you once already.
First time for everything. I thank the Shadow Chancellor for giving way. It's one of the Chancellor who understands a very basic economic point. That is, the reality is that in order to borrow, it relies on confidence. And if the individual institution that is lending you the money has no confidence that you'll be able to repay it, it means that your interest rate will go up. And if you don't manage to have the correct economic policy in place and the correct borrowing, you will actually end up with higher interest rates.
I'm not sure if that adds to the sum of human knowledge.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Shadow Chancellor for giving way. Does he think, in response to the intervention that we just had there, does he think that the Tory Brexit mess has been good for confidence in the UK economy or less good for confidence in the UK?
What I find, sometimes you can be bemused by interventions from the other side. What I find absolutely bemusing is that they've got us into a Brexit mess, as the Honourable Lady quite honestly says. They've called an unnecessary general election. They've got an unstable government, and they talk to us about confidence. Can I just say, let's just go on to others.
You agree on that one?
If I may, Mr Deputy Speaker, let me just quote a few other comments, and I'll try and move on quickly, because I can see you're getting worried about time. The Bank of England's chief economist said last week that his prediction is that 7% of our entire workforce could be on zero-hour contracts within a decade. The director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies has called the low wage growth in this country, exactly as said, completely unprecedented. The IFS also referred to the unacknowledged risks to the quality of public service under Conservatives and judged that their austerity plans would be so harsh as to be potentially undeliverable. So what's the government's response? It's a Queen's speech devoid of any serious measures to address the economic challenges facing this country, the pressures ordinary people and our public services are under, and austerity is to continue to impact upon our schools, our health service, emergency services and people's living standards. And it's going to be interesting in the autumn budget to see how the Chancellor covers the black hole derived from his last disaster of a budget. Yes. It's at least £2 billion we're aware of, and according to some commentators, it's growing up to anything up to £7 billion. And it would be particularly helpful if the Chancellor explained today how he covers the cost of the £1 billion grubby bribe to the DUP to keep his party clinging in office. That's £100 million. That's £100 million a vote. £100 million a vote. If I were a Tory backbencher, I'd want to start negotiating a slice of that action. If I was there.
I thank the member for giving way. Would he accept when it comes to grubby bribes? His party has got a lot to tell us about grubby bribes in the form of letters to terrorists to get them off their murder charges, etc. But what is grubby? What is grubby about money being put into the infrastructure in Northern Ireland to promote jobs, money going into the health service in Northern Ireland, money going into the education service? What's grubby about that?
I tell you, Honourable Gentleman, what's grubby. Sorry, I thought he was on that side. I didn't realise. I tell you what's grubby. That if we abided by the rules of our system, the Barnett formula in particular, England would get an additional £59 billion, Scotland £6 and Wales £3 billion. That's what's grubby about it. Can I just say this as well? After the miraculous discovery of the funds for the DUP deal, I don't expect in future from the other benches much more about magic money trees, do you? Listen, £1 billion was found for the DUP, but nothing to address the fundamentals of our weak and precarious economy, which, as my honourable friend has said, is now faced with the challenges of Brexit. Let me finish on this. Increasingly, people are waking up to the fact that a government lacking, what can I call it, a strong and stable leadership, is incapable of securing a deal which protects our jobs and economy. There are divisions at the top of government, a cabinet divided, rows between members of the government, own negotiating team. And these rows are breaking out on a daily basis. Rows, even within the government's negotiating team, breaking out on a daily basis as they position themselves for their own leadership challenges. And as a result, we witness weekly changes of direction in the government's negotiating stance. And that includes even the Chancellor. Only weeks ago, I'll come back to you, I will. Only weeks ago, the Chancellor was threatening no deal, walking away to set the UK up as a tax haven off the coast of continental Europe. Now it's reported he's potentially looking to the customs union and a long and uncertain transitional period. Only months ago, he went along with the government prioritisation of immigration control over the protection of jobs. Now he claims to want a jobs-first Brexit.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way? It has taken him 33 minutes to get to this country leaving the European Union, which is the defining issue affecting this country's economy. But can I just say to the gentleman, we also talk about divisions. He might want to think about the 100 members of his party that have been through the shadow cabinet in the course of the last parliament in his own party. But he might also want to ask questions, and his backbenchers might want to ask him questions about his lamentable performance and the lamentable performance of his leader in the referendum last year. If they felt strongly about Brexit, they'd have been defending the membership of the EU.
Can I just say, I was hoping to call you very early, and I want to save that speech till then rather than now 12 February. John McDonnell.
That was a great speech, though. Can I look? Could I send her? I'm quite used to throwing red books about in this place, but what I'll do is I'll send her a copy of the manifesto which this party is united behind. All this, the failed, yes, united behind, I'm proud to say it. All this, the failed, all this, Mr Deputy Speaker, the failed and deeply unpopular austerity programme, the deeply divided rudderless cabinet, the directionless Brexit negotiating strategy and a contentless Queen's speech surely confirms it's time for this government now to go. It's time for change. Our amendment today addresses the change that's needed. As the Labour Party demonstrated during the general election campaign, there is an alternative. We can address the deep-rooted problems our economy faces. The Labour Party has forged ahead with a serious, credible alternative to the government's failed approach. Our society can afford decent public services. We're the fifth richest economy in the world. If we have a fair taxation system, we can end the cuts in schools' budgets. We can end the horrific sight of children sleeping on chairs in hospital corridors. We can end the bedroom tax and the punitive benefits sanctions regime. And we can do that, as the IFS confirmed, while remaining on target to eliminate the budget deficit in accordance with our fiscal credibility rule. But it's not just about a fairer taxation system. We need a government to invest what's needed to secure our future. Not the derisory numbers floated by the Chancellor in the autumn statement, with so little to back them up. A serious, long-term vision of the economy, which tackles the regional disparities and the changes taking place in the labour market. A commitment to drive up productivity by increasing investment, as demanded by the CBI and many others, and delivering a serious industrial strategy. It's a transformative programme we look forward to implementing in government shortly. This Queen's speech does nothing to solve these problems. It confirms a government isolated from the real world in which our people live. Labour's amendment today sets out the alternative our country so desperately needs. I urge all honourable members to support the amendment.